Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Tonight on the show, we will be turning our attention to the US and the latest developments there after Trump supporters breached the Capitol building early this morning. But first, let's start with some local news. We have the Registrar of Societies declining to register as official political parties, both Parti Pejuang Tanah Air and the Malaysian United Democratic Alliance, or better known as MUDA. Now, the ROS did not state a reason why it rejected the applications. Just to note that the Registrar of Societies is under the purview of the Home Minister, Hamzah Zainuddin.
Yeah, so Melissa, I think this expression I'm about to use is going to be used all throughout the evening, which is, surprised, aghast, appalled, but not, shocked, but not surprised. And I think that's something. The reason is we're not surprised is because of the way in which we've come to accept that certain administrative matters are deeply politicized in this country. And so what ought to be a purely administrative matter, putting together, registering a political party, unless there's some extraordinary reasons why that political party should not exist.
Any society or association,
should not exist.
Right?
Then the question is, why haven't we turned the corner on this kind of authoritarian politics, when the matters of administration are in fact deeply political?
Yes, and I'm wondering about the optics. What you said no surprise, but whether this is going to cement a perception that the ROS, the Registrar of Societies, is seen to be partisan, seems to have, I guess, a politicized undertone. And there's been calls before, I believe in the past, it's not the first time that applications have been turned down or rejected, and there have been calls in the past for registration of political parties to be under the purview of the Election Commission instead of the Registrar of Societies. But I wonder whether there's political will for that, really.
Well, and of course the question is, why has this remained on the books, or what this practice been allowed to carry on for all these years? Which is that it benefits the party in power. The party in power, benefits from being able to prevent legitimate forms of political expression from emerging through political parties by, not allowing them to register. But having said that, I think our friends in the world of politics are very wily. I'm sure they'll find other ways. We know that political parties sometimes, people aspiring to head a new party might actually buy a shell party, a party that's already registered, but in all intents and purposes is defunct. And so they take over that party and give it new life.
Well, in politics, there's always a way. All right, in other news, we have an open letter addressed to the Prime Minister, Muhyiddin Yassin, in which 46 public health experts have raised concern over the current status of the COVID-19 outbreak in the country. They point to the increasing number of COVID cases reported daily, and this despite lockdowns and other health interventions. To quote them, they say the national COVID metrics, they claim, paint a very bleak picture of the COVID-19 pandemic management. Now, this comes as Malaysia reported over 3,000 new infections today. This is a new high in the daily cases reported.
So, Melissa, here the issue is a bleak picture, not just of the pandemic, but actually of the management of the public health response. And I think that's where this letter is crucial. I think Malaysia does not lack expertise. There's almost 50 names that are undersigned.
The who's who of public health.
And so we clearly have the expertise. The question is whether we're using them and whether the governance of the public health response is open to criticism, can recalibrate, re-strategize, or is it a kind of closed-loop system in which those people at the top are trying to protect their own interests or protect their own reputations by not allowing for dissent and not admitting that there have been failures or lapses? And we've had, we've talked about these failures endlessly on this show in terms of blind spots in policies and such. So, yes, this is a very timely letter because we seem to be turning the corner again, deepening in terms of the the nature of the disease and the pandemic here in Malaysia. And while actually hope springs eternal for the vaccine to appear as part of a solution for what's going on.
It's just one of the tools, right? And what I like about this letter, and it's floating around, so I'm sure you'd be able to read it if you looked it up.
It's on Code Blue, the website.
And all the news outlets, you know, in that letter, in the open letter, it says they propose 10 urgent actions that Malaysia can take. And again, as you mentioned, the vaccine, just one of them. But I think you're right. It's not assigning blame, but really what we can do right now before things get worse, or as the letter says, before Malaysia slips into the COVID-19 intensive care. And I do want to ask about the messaging, whether it's enough lately now to just say, stay at home unless if you don't have to go out, whether that messaging is actually going to be enough to kind of curb the numbers that we're seeing daily.
Yeah, well, there's two things, because we're loath to assign blame because we're also very polite. But the question is, if we don't identify the problems or the people who are problematic, then we'll never have accountability, we'll never change. Now, the other thing that the letter, I think, is worth noting is that they do talk about how if there is a lockdown, there will have to be, as in many countries, support for those sectors of the economy that will need it. And so the question is, the public health response is, we've said this endlessly. I mean, it's almost a platitude at this point in time. It needs to be holistic. And the question is whether all those different levers of government are working in concert at this point in time.
All right. We're going to be looking at this story, perhaps looking at the government's response to this open letter by 46 public health experts. Okay, we're going to take a quick break on Consider This. But after this, we will be taking a closer look at the future of American democracy. Did US President Donald Trump incite the attack on the Capitol building? That's coming up in just a few minutes. Stay tuned.
COVID-19 masih belum berakhir. Dalam kita berusaha memutuskan rantaian wabak ini, kita jangan terpedaya dengan virus maklumat palsu. Simak fakta melalui www.esraawani.com atau aplikasi Esra Awani. Teruskan berdisiplin, ratakan lengkungan pandemik ini.
The third wave of COVID-19 has taken us by storm. There's no room to take anything lightly. Everyone must follow all the steps to stop the spread of COVID-19. Social distancing, face masks, follow these steps, this SOP with the utmost discipline. Together, we can flatten the curve.
Perang COVID-19 tetap belum berakhir. Pastikan setiap langkah berjaga-jaga diamalkan, dari kebersihan tangan, pemakaian pelitup muka, penjarakan fizikal. Kesemuanya amat penting untuk pastikan pandemik ini dibendung.
Fokus kita sekarang adalah gelombang ketiga. Elakkan 3S, iaitu kawasan yang sesak, sempit dan juga bersembang pada jarak yang dekat. Berdisiplinlah kerana virus ini tidak mengira darjat, umur mahupun latar belakang anda. Tiada masa untuk kita berlengah lagi.
Kita sekarang telah memasuki gelombang ketiga COVID-19. Setiap langkah pencegahan perlu diamalkan dengan penuh tanggungjawab dan disiplin. Kita mampu meratakan lengkung pandemik ini. Semuanya di tangan kita bersama.
We've done great so far, but the fight is far from over. We need to be vigilant to keep ourselves and others safe. Wear a mask, wash your hands, and when you're out, keep a safe distance. In fighting this virus, we can't relax, so don't be lax.
The war on COVID-19 is not over. We should not take this lightly. Let us ensure all steps are taken to avoid the spread of the virus, be it social.
Hi, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. With me is Sharad Kuttan. The US Congress has formally certified President-elect Joe Biden's election victory. just hours after Trump supporters stormed the Capitol in an attack that saw 4 people die. Despite the shock of the attack, several Republican congressmen continued to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the elections. They repeated allegations of fraud that the president had used since the November elections, and which he had used minutes before he called on his supporters to march on the Capitol building. Despite a belated reassurance of an orderly transfer on January 20th, will the US continue to be a deeply divided country, with domestic terrorism by white supremacists a major security challenge? Joining us on the show now, we have Derek Backer. He is the Assistant Professor of Politics and International Relations at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Good evening, Derek. Now, many expressed shock at the attack on what is deemed to be the symbolic epicenter of US democracy. But were these events a real surprise to you?
Well, I mean, I don't think the violence is surprising. I am a little surprised they stormed the Capitol. I really just expected the Proud Boys and the other white nationalists to do their normal fragile masculinity thing out in the streets, beating up people. I didn't expect them to, essentially attempt an insurrection, but they were egged on by the president in one of the most seditious acts you could think of by a president. I mean, that's shocking. I mean, President Trump clearly engaged in an act of sedition, aided and abetted by elected Republicans as well. That is shocking.
Derek, many people reach for an explanation of events in America now via kind of a, garden variety cycle an analysis of Trump's personality. But is this really just about Trump? Is it about a wounded pride that the president feels having lost the election?
Well, I mean, he definitely has a role in this, and there's certainly his character matters, but it's like throwing a lit match into the fuel. It had to be there to begin with, and we highlight the role of white nationalists in this and the aggressiveness, this populist response that we're seeing, if we're going to get a nice term, that long predates Donald Trump, but his particular character, his narcissism, his egotism fed it. Undoubtedly, that's how he got elected. So I don't think you can put it entirely on him, but certainly the events that have occurred recently are entirely on his shoulders, yes.
Well, some analysts have pointed that this could be, a group of, extreme Trump supporters with fringe ideas. But I'm wondering, have these fringe ideas been mainstreamed? Is this the thinking of a larger collective?
I don't know if I go so far as to say the larger collective. I mean, Trump has been repudiated by the vast majority of Americans twice now. But his views are becoming slightly more mainstream in the Republican Party. A number of people who believe in that QAnon conspiracy nonsense were elected, and a lot of them were storming the Capitol. But the white nationalism, the militias, the particular source of violence long predates him there. And I don't know if I would say that's mainstream necessarily, but there's certainly a high degree of tolerance for it in the Republican Party. I mean, look at Senator Cruz and Josh Hawley, equally guilty of sedition, if you ask me, and pretty much just about every other commentator right now in the United States. They've certainly accepted this. Whether they do so for hypocritical, personal, political reasons, I don't know, and it doesn't really matter whether you believe it or not. You're stoking these kinds of flames. But I would hesitate to say mainstream. Maybe mainstream somewhat in the Republican Party, yes.
Okay.
Derek, there's still almost 2 weeks to go before the inauguration. Does Trump's reassurance of an orderly transition ring true to you, or do you think he's going to pull something out of the bag in the next 2 weeks that should make people worried about these next 2 weeks?
I'm worried. I mean, and I'm not alone in thinking this, I definitely think it is time to invoke the 25th Amendment. He needs to be removed from power immediately. He is a threat to public safety, and he is a threat to the security of the United States, and he has certainly violated his oath of office. He has to be removed. There is no telling what he will do. I mean, like I said, I was somewhat shocked by his actions, which were a clear incitement to violence in legal sense and very much seditious and traitorous. What else is he going to do? He's a wounded man at this point. His pride is hurt, and he's borderline insane at this point. Okay, Derek, won't the 25th Amendment of invoking that require Mike Pence, the vice president, to get involved? Will he do that? Well, I mean, you're starting to see little rumors here and there across news sites about discussions. Whether or not he's involved, I don't know. I think he should be involved. What has he got to lose? His career is over. I think for the good of the country, he needs to do it. If he doesn't do it, there are other mechanisms where Congress can appoint a committee to determine whether Trump is fit for office. That will obviously take a lot more time. The quickest route is definitely with a meeting of the cabinet and the vice president. All they need is a simple majority to remove him temporarily from office. He wouldn't be impeached or anything like that. Pence would only be the acting president. But that's enough. Trump would be without any power at all under those conditions.
Okay, Derek, one of the things that was overshadowed by the events of yesterday were actually the events that started the day, which is because the wins in the Georgia senatorial races. Could you just walk us through the significance of that, especially for how Trump is viewed by the Republican Party?
Well, I mean, I definitely went to bed last night a little bit happier than I have been in quite some time. Seeing Reverend Warnock elected first black man in Georgia, that in and of itself is historic. Jon Ossoff defeating Purdue itself, also a monumental achievement. It certainly helps out Biden quite a bit, and it clearly showed the limitations of Trump's appeal and the dangerousness of his very divisive rhetoric. I mean, he clearly sabotaged the election down there. But at the same time, the Democrats turned out. Those wins belong to the Democrats and Stacey Abrams, but Trump definitely played a hand in that. And I think the benefit of that is there are at least some sane voices in the Republican Party who can say, look, Trump's not the future. He's dangerous. Well, but I don't know how many voices those are. What, Mitt Romney? That's it.
Derek, do you see Republicans looking to delink themselves to Donald Trump? What do you see his influence in the Republican Party? And I do want to ask you, do you expect him to remain in active politics after this?
I think he's going to remain some kind of sort of metaphorical bomb thrower. But, despite all the things that happened yesterday, 120 House Republicans nonetheless objected to the Electoral College votes, and 6 senators did so. So I don't think he's going to be abandoned by a sizable chunk of the party. But I do think there's going to have to be some kind of reckoning. But for 4 years now, every element of that party, with few exceptions, have put up with Donald Trump for the most craven political reasons. Tax cuts for rich people and and judges that will essentially roll back civil rights. That's what they wanted. So the rot is incredibly deep in the Republican Party. I don't know what happens next. I'm not that well connected to Republican Party circles, things like that. But they seriously have to address this problem. He's going to be influential on a grassroots level on impacting primaries. But I think his political career is pretty much dead at this point.
Derek, let's turn our attention to the people who actually stormed the Capitol building. I think CNN newscasters had a hard time. I was watching it unfold. They had a hard time naming the mobs, rioters, and so on. And then somebody said terrorists, and why not terrorists as well? What exactly is going to happen with that group? And understand that security agencies have long been warning the establishment of white supremacist groups as the main threat to, in terms of domestic terrorism, not Islamicist groups, and yet that's been resisted. What's going to happen now?
Well, I mean, I definitely think there's going to be a series of arrests. I don't know what these individuals will be charged with. Sedition is clearly an option there. If they were clearly attempting to overthrow a government, in my field, that's just the definition of a coup d'etat. It was a failed one by a group of idiots, but nevertheless, that's what it was. And that's laid out in the Constitution. It's one of the few, if only, crimes laid out in the Constitution to attempt to overthrow the government. They need to be punished to the full extent of the law, and it has to happen, much like Trump has to be punished. But whether or not we're going to accept white nationalism as the primary threat, I mean, this is something that the Department of Justice noted early in the Obama administration. This isn't new. And not everyone at this, in these insurrectionists or mob, whatever you want to call them, they weren't all white nationalists, but they were certainly white nationalists adjacent. There were a lot of QAnon people there, and maybe they're a new kind of threat as well. These are clearly people who do not believe in the legitimacy of the U.S. government at this point. They are a clear, violent threat to the stability of the country.
Derek, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. We really appreciate your time. We're going to take a quick break here on Consider This, but stay tuned. We'll be back with more.
berakhir. Dalam kita berusaha memutuskan rantaian wabak ini, kita jangan terpedaya dengan virus maklumat palsu. Simak fakta melalui www.esraawani.com atau aplikasi Esra Awani. Teruskan berdisiplin, ratakan lengkungan pandemik ini.
The third wave of COVID-19 has taken us by storm. There's no room to take anything lightly. Everyone must follow all the steps to stop the spread of COVID-19. Social distancing, face masks, follow these steps, this SOP with the utmost discipline. Together, we can flatten the curve.
Perang COVID-19 tetap belum berakhir. Pastikan setiap langkah berjaga-jaga diamalkan, dari kebersihan tangan, pemakaian pelitup muka, penjarakan fizikal. Kesemuanya amat penting untuk pastikan pandemik ini dibendung.
Fokus kita sekarang adalah gelombang ketiga. Elakkan 3S, iaitu kawasan yang sesak,
Hi, thanks for staying with Sharad and I on Consider This. Strongly worded statements streamed in from world leaders following the siege on the Capitol building in the US. German Chancellor Angela Merkel said she felt angry and sad. French President Emmanuel Macron said what happened today in Washington, D.C. is not American. We believe in the strength of American democracy. And meanwhile, in the People's Republic of China, they likened the Washington, D.C. mob to democracy protesters in Hong Kong. But just how dangerous is a domestically unstable America to the rest of the world? Adrian Ang joins us now. He's a research fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. Adrian, the siege by Trump supporters, is that all just a bit of political theatre, or is that something more? Is it a sign of instability that should worry allies around the world?
Hi, Melissa. Hi, Sharad. Thank you for having me back on. I think it is definitely more than a piece of political theatre, right? So Trump may have originally intended the march of his supporters in Washington, D.C. as a sign of continued strength and to intimidate Congress, but once the rioters, the mob, physically attacked the U.S. Capitol building, this was a sign that the division and the polarization of the country has gotten out of control. That this is the culmination of, a month-long program by the president and his enablers to basically delegitimize elections in the United States. And it also shows, I think, the scope of the problems that Biden is going to face. That all his principal problems are going to be domestic. COVID-19, the recession, and now, right, a very deeply divided and polarized country. And that foreign policy is basically going to be left to the realm of firefighting.
Adrian, I want to ask you about the proper frame, the adequate frame in which to understand the politics. We mentioned Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, all of whom also face what we call populist pressures, in the European context. Is that frame of populism adequate to understand what's happening in the US?
I think populism is only one part of what we're seeing in the U.S., right? So there is also an element of white nationalism sort of combined with populism, and also a sort of general resentment in a large segment of the American population that feels that it has been neglected, taken for granted, and also and has felt left behind by globalization and other sort of larger forces.
Well, Trump has promised an orderly transition. It came a little late, but he has promised this. And I'm wondering, do you think that the next 2 weeks will be one that is orderly, or are we going to be looking at the threat of more domestic terrorism by white supremacists? Is that going to be a security challenge in the next few weeks?
I think, we have sort of reached the point where, once political violence has occurred, right? Sort of the first instance, was shocking, right? Sort of the second might be easier for it to happen. So I think everybody has to be braced for whatever might or might not happen next.
Adrian, what are the implications for international relations, especially views of the U.S. by its rivals, China, for instance, its allies in Europe, maybe out in the cold during the Trump years, but will they be looking at a significantly weakened America that will not have the resolve to kind of step up to global leadership in a time when there are going to be these superpower rivalries very close to home with us in the South China Sea, for instance?
Right. So I think you bring up a good point, right? So the events on Capitol Hill and the site of the U.S. Capitol building basically being ransacked by a mob, right, is highly damaging to America's image, both to itself and also to the world. So it is damaging to American soft power as the world's oldest democracy and a country that attempts to foster greater democracy in the world. So you can probably be sure that there are leaders in Beijing that are right now that whether they say it or not, are probably quite delighted at what they've seen, because again, this damages America's standing in the world.
Right.
America would then be hypocritical to go around lecturing other countries about the virtues of democracy when it appears unable to take care of its own affairs.
And that was quite reflected also in Emmanuel Macron's comments, where he said that he still believes in the strength of American democracy. I'm wondering, Adrian, do you believe in the strength of the American democracy? Are American institutions strong enough to withstand this period of instability that we're seeing?
So, that is the question, because, I think before Trump, if you had asked me about the resilience of American institutions, I would have given you an unequivocal yes, right? But if anything has taught us about the Trump presidency is that America's democratic institutions and norms are much less resilient than anyone thought for, right? So the danger really is less so about Trump, because he has less than 2 weeks to go. But the danger is that someone after Trump, right, sort of following in his footsteps, but also somebody that is probably sort of more capable, more competent than Trump, will pose a much greater danger to American democracy.
Adrian, is part of the problem that the source of the attack or delegitimacy of the democratic system came from the person who is supposed to secure it, and in fact is supposed to be its biggest champion? It was Donald Trump who was trying to undermine democracy, not some fringe group.
Yes, right. So I mean, it was very clear, right? Sort of during the president's impeachment, that I think, if most Republicans had been sort of honest with themselves, right, they would have said that the president was guilty of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. But of course, right, the House fulfilled its responsibility in impeaching Donald Trump, but the Senate, a Republican-controlled Senate, failed to do its duty, right? And the only sort of Republican, I would argue, that can hold his head up high was Mitt Romney, right? Sort of Romney said the president was guilty of an impeachable offense, right? And that really told us a lot about Donald Trump.
Adrian, always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight and sharing those interesting perspectives. We appreciate your time. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and good night.